Good afternoon. Professor Unger asked me if I would be willing to discuss the history of ideas in the United States refracted through the lives of exemplary Americans. And so I put together some images, and I want to just discuss some exemplary lives as a way of building on and informing this understanding and revising the understanding of American democracy. And I'll start by emphasizing in the colonial period after the Revolution, throughout the 19th century into the early 20th century, Americans were often very insecure, and there was an insecurity about the United States vis-a-vis Europe. And it really began in the 18th century, in which one of the Western culture's leading naturalists, Comte Buffon, he published a multi-volume work on natural history. And in it he argued that America, North America, but the Americas in general, were devoid of large, powerful creatures, and that its inhabitants were feeble by comparison to Europeans. Feeble or inferior in terms of both physical, mental, and intellectual attributes. And it was so popular that North Americans, they devoted themselves to trying to refute this widespread claim. And I should say that this insecurity related to cultural productions of literature, visual art, other cultural artistic productions continued into the World War II period. And in fact, one anecdote or example is that in 1950, and there was a study done in 1950, in English departments in the United States, and in English departments, you had the option of teaching literature in English, which could be both United States, it could be Australia, it could be England. In 1950, less than 5% of all assigned literature read in English departments or assigned in English departments had anything to do with America. If you were a serious writer, if you were a serious critic, if you were a serious reader, you read British literature. You read literature in the continent. And that was also true in art history. If you were an art history major, after World War II, you studied European art, not American art. So one of the things I want to do is to contextualize that and to explain that. And I'll begin with the artist, Charles Willson Peale. And this is in 1801. And so Peale was very much part of the group of American. Jefferson was involved, a number of the leaders of trying to exhume and identify, to search for large mammals in the United States to refute the idea that mammals in particular in North America died out. So here's Charles Willson Peale with a massive mastodon bone in 1801. And he spearheaded this effort to exhume this massive mammal a mastodon, and this is a painting that Peale painted, the exhumation of the mastodon, and he was the first American to create an art museum that preserved this refutation of North Americans being inferior and less strong in all capabilities than Americans. So here's the artist in his museum where he's lifting up the cloak, that's suggesting all of these different animals are at least as strong in North America as they are in Europe. And here's another Peale and and Titian Peale, his son, the long room, the interior view. So it was the first major museum in the United States was really created to refute this notion. So that's part of a context, which is one of the reasons why, if you were a person of means, and you wanted to be recognized and esteemed in the United States, throughout the 19th century, you went to Europe. You spent time in Europe. And if you established yourself in Europe, when you came back, you were treated as a significant figure. And there are countless examples. One of them is Charles Sumner, who grew up in the black neighborhood of Boston. He was at the North Slope. He came from comparatively little money. He borrowed money. He goes to Europe, and he was celebrated throughout Europe. And when he returns from Europe, that helps to anchor his reputation as a leading intellectual because of the people, the friends that he made, the contacts that he established. And for every aspiring, ambitious young man or woman, if you had money, and in Sumner's case, if you didn't, you borrowed it, you went to Europe. And you tested your mettle with Europeans. And if you succeeded, then you were seen as a leader. And that was true of the founders. I want to start to spend some time with Benjamin Franklin, because Franklin is not just one of the founders, but Franklin. And it's a trope or a concept that's particularly resonant in the United States, and that is that Franklin essentially creates the trope of the self-made man. And in fact, he does so in writing what most scholars consider to be the first autobiography. Now, Franklin grew up middle class. His father was an artisan, and we've talked about the artisanship in the late 18th, early 19th century. His father ran a shop that made soap and candles, and Franklin defined himself instead as a poor man, and he, with Rousseau, created the genre of autobiography. Before Franklin and before Rousseau, there was a memoir and a confession. And it was the standard form of an I narrative. Was a confession or a memoir. A memoir focused on the public life of an individual. And it was usually a statesman or a military hero, a famous figure, and it focused all on the public life. You got nothing of the interior or emotional life. And the confession was an I narrative that focused on the private, especially the religious life. There's a long tradition in religious history in Western culture of the confession focusing on one's relationship with God or its equivalent. And the term autobiography, which doesn't enter the English language until after Franklin's autobiography, it initially was called a memoir, and then once autobiography becomes a term that brings together both the private and the public life, fusing the outer and inner life, that's how an autobiography is defined. The other example, or the main example of confession, is St. Augustine's Confessions. That's the paradigm of the private life, the self grappling with one's relationship with God, and it usually involves a crisis and recovery, sin and redemption. Franklin's, as I said, Franklin always called his autobiography a memoir because the term autobiography does not enter the English language until after he's dead. And his memoir and Rousseau's Confessions, they're the first two examples of fusing, as I said, the private and the public self. Franklin embraced this concept of a sovereign self, a self-governing individual, one who could dismantle original sin, one who could achieve moral perfection. And in fact, how many of you here have not read Franklin's autobiography? You need to read it. It's a foundational American text. It's foundational. So in his autobiography, hopefully this will inspire you to read it. He has a 12-step program, the first 12-step program to improve the self. I'll just spell them out. 1, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. 2, speak not but what may benefit others or yourselves. Avoid trifling conversations. Be serious in all things. 3, let all your things have their places. Be neat, be organized. 4, resolve to perform what you ought. Perform without fail what you resolve. 5, make no expense but to do good to others or yourself, i.e., waste nothing. 6, lose no time. Time is money. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. 7, use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly. 8, wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty. 9, avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. 10, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, habitation, mind, spirit. 11, be not disturbed at trifles or accidents, common or unavoidable. 12, rarely use venery, but for health or offspring. Do you know what venery means?
Veneration. Sex.
Pardon?
Sex.
Yeah. And he added a 13th one. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. And his autobiography, in a sense, describes this evolution toward virtue, toward the book of virtue. It's a model example of these virtues. It describes this continual self-evolution, this evolution towards near perfection, if not perfection, and transformation. And in fact, Franklin, at the early age of 22, composed for himself an epitaph that reads, "The body of Ben Franklin, printer, He's 22. And it becomes the epitaph. The body of Benjamin Franklin, printer, like the covering of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be lost. It will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more beautiful edition, corrected and amended by the author. And that is indeed on his tombstone. His autobiography ensures that Franklin's self will not be lost. The epitaph he designed both reflected his ambition for fame, and his autobiography also reflected his effort to disseminate these virtues and this self. His autobiography owes much to the fact in tracing the development that Franklin gave classic expression to three powerful ingredients of the American dream: material success, moral regeneration, and social progress. And he believed that the United States, this new nation, was a site in which all three could flourish. Franklin becomes a kind of archetype of the self-made man. And that understanding of the self-made man, which was coined in part as an inspiration to Franklin, but the very term self-made man was not actually first disseminated until 1834, in which Henry Clay, one of the great, at that time he was known as one of the founders of the Whig Party. Henry Clay, in a speech in Congress, said that he was people accused him of growing up or coming from a very elite, wealthy family. Henry Clay disputed that and said, "No, I am a self-made man." And what self-making meant from Franklin through Clay and through the 19th century was the notion that no matter where you come from, you can continually evolve and rise up, and if not realize one's dreams, come close to it. So it explodes the understanding of a rigorous hierarchy, a rigorous social hierarchy. That in the United States, anyone can, if they're with luck and pluck, realize one's dreams or one's potential. In a sense, there is a similar self-making of America characterized by the language of the opening paragraphs of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The first person plural, the inner and outer self, the people bring themselves into being, and this differs from every other constitution and governing doctrine of the time. Franklin in America described self-making through reason, progress, and rationality, and this quest for perfection. And Franklin emphasizes the reason should govern passion. The order of precedence was the rational faculties of the will. Conscience or self-interest were affectations and passions. Franklin also was published, among many other pamphlets, a book called The Way to Wealth. Have any of you read The Way to Wealth? It's first published in 1757. It was in print throughout the 19th century. I think it may still be in print. And the cardinal virtues, or the basic thesis of the way to wealth, is 1, God helps those that help themselves. 2, God gives all things to industry. So if you help yourself and you're industrious, you will be successful. And then everyone knows this maxim, or if not cliche, from Franklin: early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And this is a photograph, or this is a painting, or a portrait, and it shows Franklin's his understanding of himself. It's Franklin with a bust of Sir Isaac Newton, while Franklin was seen as a man of the world in England. It was painted in England, and at a time in which he was the colonial agent for Pennsylvania from 1757 to the eve of the Revolution, at which point he left. Franklin watched the coronation of George III, soon after called him the best king any nation was ever blessed with before the Revolution broke out. The pose of the elbow on the table and the thumb under the chin to hold the focus of the spectacles was characteristic of Franklin, according to contemporaries. So he kept his chin up because if the chin dropped, the bifocals would fall, and he wanted to be looking up, out, as a enlightened individual. In fact, he liked the portrait well enough to order a separate copy for himself. And Martin completed the copy in 1772. And so Franklin is foundational for articulating this notion of self-making, in which one rises up on one's merit, and initially through until the end of the 19th century, self-making had much less to do with wealth, and more to do with realizing one's dreams, until the Civil War, a lot of it was just realizing one's ambition to be an artisan, to be an independent entrepreneur or artisan, in the northern states. That Franklin was foundational, as I said, in developing this concept of self-making. Let me jump then to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is very different. How many of you have not read Uncle Tom's Cabin? So almost all of you have. That's good. Uncle Tom's Cabin made Stowe one of the most famous, not just writers, but Americans in American history. Her novel was an incredibly important catalyst for political and social change, and Uncle Tom's Cabin encapsulates central tensions in the United States, both in terms of race and slavery. And she was, in her day, seen as one of the greatest authors. And in fact, at that time in the 19th century, from the Revolution through the Civil War, the leading authors, especially of fiction, were women. Women dominated the literary marketplace, and were able to make an immense amount of money, to such a degree that someone like Hawthorne, who was bent on experimenting with his prose and never made a lot of money from writing, depended upon the Democratic Party for sinecures. At one point was so frustrated at the success of women writers that he publicly damned what he called this scribbling mob of women writers. He was, because he felt threatened, because he felt that they were taking advantage of him. Harry Beecher Stowe met with President Lincoln in the White House in 1862, and Lincoln purportedly greeted her with the words, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." If Lincoln did not say that, he should have, because the novel became one of the central catalysts leading to the war. It was a sensation. 10,000 copies were sold in the first week. That'd be equivalent to 300,000 being sold in a year. 300,000 were sold in the first year. It'd be equivalent to having a book in which 4.2 million copies were sold in a year. That's just unprecedented. It doesn't happen today. And it was a period in which reading the novel was the most popular genre. You could actually, the best way to understand the novel in the 19th century is that the novel in the 19th century was the primary way by which Americans understood themselves and their community and society. Not in nonfiction, not in politics, but through the novel. In much the same way that arguably in the 20th century, the movie, the cinema replaces the novel as the primary means by which Americans understand themselves and their society. And in the 21st century, it's social media. So the novel was, the significance, the importance of the novel, both culturally, aesthetically, and politically, was it's immensely powerful. Reading aloud was also a favorite pastime. The Literary World, one of the leading literary journals, estimated that any given novel had 10 readers or listeners for every purchase. It was often a communal event in which you would gather a family or friends and you would read together out loud. It also meant you read slowly, so you absorbed the details of the book. There were also countless stage adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In fact, more people saw the stage adaptations than read the book. And unfortunately, in contrast to the book, most of the stage adaptations were profoundly racist, far more racist than the book was. It's not to say the book is not, Stowe does not have her own kind of racist understanding. But the stage adaptations were deeply racist. Foreign sales of Uncle Tom's Cabin exceeded American sales owing to the absence of international copyright. In fact, in England, Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 100,000 copies a month. It was so popular in England that during the war, when the rebel diplomat William Yancey tried to win British support for the Confederacy, he failed because, as he said, too many Britons had read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Had Britain recognized the Confederacy, it would have almost certainly brought a Confederate victory based on arms, weapons, food that they would have provided to the rebels. The novel was translated into numerous languages. It was translated into Russian in 1857, and the Russian translation fueled anti-slavery passions that led Tsar Alexander to abolish serfdom in February of 1861 in Russia. So the influence of the novel was truly, it extended into Europe. By the end of the 19th century, according to some estimates, Uncle Tom's Cabin sold more copies than any other book, save the Bible. Lincoln may not have said that Stowe's book started the war, but if he didn't, he should have. Because what we can say with certainty is that the forces that led to war and emancipation made possible the art of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I want to just summarize how Stowe came to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. One, she was the daughter of one of the preeminent ministers in the United States. She comes from a deeply religious family. The novel is infused with the power of faith, of religion, and of God and Jesus being within one and able to transform and affect the affairs of one's world and one's life. There are two forces in particular that led directly to Uncle Tom's Cabin. One was the death of her 18-month-old son, Charlie, from cholera. This is actually in this daguerreotype of a postmortem of Charlie Stowe is at Harvard. And it was during a period in which photography was one of the most popular new inventions. Americans had a love of photography that surpassed that of every other nation, and one of the most popular forms of photography was a postmortem. Because a daguerreotype, which was the first form of photography, to this day is still the most detailed form. And Americans believed that a daguerreotype was less a representation and more the essence. They literally believed that a daguerreotype preserved part of the body and the soul. And so the postmortem genre was hugely popular. If you lost a family member, one of your first calls was to a daguerreotypist. And Americans believed that the soul left the body gradually. So the sooner you brought a daguerreotypist to the home, the more of the body and soul would be preserved under the glass, under that daguerreotype. And so Stowe said, it was at Charlie's dying bed and at his grave that I learnt what a poor slave mother may feel when her child is torn away from her. The second inspiration was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And in case you're not unfamiliar with it, it was probably the most draconian, one of the most draconian laws ever passed in the United States. Suspects were denied the right to jury trial. Federally appointed commissioners, rather than a judge, determined the fate of the suspected fugitive. And a commissioner received $10 if the suspect was remanded into slavery, only $5 if you set the suspect free. The suspect was denied the right of appeal, and the new law required all citizens to assist in the capture of suspected fugitives, meaning that you could be deputized at any moment to help round up a suspected fugitive. And ironically, this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 it electrified Northerners and dramatically increased the number of anti-slavery folks in the Northern communities, because anyone could be forced to be deputized and to round up a suspected fugitive at any moment. And they were abolitionists, black and white abolitionists, referred to it as kidnapping in Boston. Boston was a central site of a number of kidnapping cases. This was a broadside of Thomas Sims in 1851. The Fugitive Slave Law was part of the compromise to keep the Union together. Henry Clay, the founder of the Whig Party, the best way to understand the Whig Party is the party of compromise. The Democratic Party by 1850s was primarily a pro-slavery party, with the exception of initially barn-burning Democrats that helped form the anti-slavery Republican Party. The South and the Compromise of 1850 wanted more protection of their slaves because of the monetary value, and they were also felt their dishonored masters did if slaves escaped. There was, as I said, no jury trial, and that was the second inspiration for the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which the novel coincides with his success. Another important factor that led to the political power of Uncle Tom's Cabin was that by 1850, slavery was without question the most talked about subject in the country, especially the North. Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, which I'll get into shortly, the second autobiography, which is, I think, of his three autobiographies, his real masterpiece. His second autobiography sold 15,000 copies in the first 2 weeks. It was a huge bestseller, and it's a work of deep and intellectual autobiography. And in fact, Douglass's first narrative, published in 1845, 10 years earlier, was one of the inspirations that led to Dickens's Great Expectations. Dickens read Douglass's narrative and was one of the inspirations for Dickens to publish Great Expectations. Anti-slavery newspapers were hugely popular. The National Era was first serialized Uncle Tom's Cabin, and throughout the 19th century, for writers from Stowe to Henry James, novels were first serialized. So each week, it was usually in weekly papers, you had a chapter each week, and that allowed the author to revise the serialization in publishing the book based on feedback from audiences. And so when Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book was published in 1852, tens of thousands of people had already read it in its serial form. And anti-slavery newspapers were also hugely popular at the time. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the best way to describe it is that it's a collective slave narrative. It's an immense elaboration of Aesop's fables. If any of you have read Aesop's fables, Aesop was a freed person in antiquity, and his fables are about enslaved people in antiquity seeking any means they can to become free. Stowe chose the genre of the novel because she recognized its power and its popularity. As I mentioned, the novel was a kind of people's history. It was also, importantly, a woman's pulpit. It was one of the few popular voices, public voices, in which women could disseminate their voice. And in fact, around the same time, actually a few years earlier in 1830, Maria Stewart, an African-American woman living in the black neighborhood of Boston on the North Slope, was the first woman that we know of to give a public speech to fellow African Americans and a few radical whites who were in the community. Women were seen as they should not disseminate, they should not publicly speak, and so the novel became the one genre in which they were able to have a voice. In fact, women dominated the fiction market in terms of royalties and sales. And popular novels were also didactic. They embodied the moral, religious doctrines. They expounded the branch of knowledge. They converted readers to a specific perspective. And the way, how many of you have read Uncle Tom's Cabin? So if you have, you know that in a sense, Stowe writes as a preacher. She tells these dramatic tales, and then she'll step back just like a preacher does and give you the lessons of this story. What are the lessons? What are the Christian lessons we can learn from this story? And in the 20th century, a number of critics have been very critical of that narrative strategy because in modernism, one of the keynotes of 20th century writing is you show, don't tell. You don't summarize, you don't tell. You evoke, you show. Stowe does both. She writes this dramatic narrative, then she stands back and tells her readers what the significance is, what it means, which was very popular. And the best example is in the last chapter, although she does it throughout. At the end of this story, which is partly successful, although there's also a tragedy in it, where she specifically, and she does this throughout, she ends the book by asking, what can any individual do? Of that, every individual can judge. There is one thing that every individual can do. They can see to it that they feel right. An atmosphere of sympathetic influence encircles every human being, and the man or woman who feels strongly, healthily, and justly on the great interests of humanity is a constant benefactor to the human race. See then to your sympathies in this matter. Are they in harmony with the sympathies of Christ, or are they swayed and perverted by the sophistries of worldly policy? That's essentially how she ends. So she's calling on her readers to say, you have a choice that you can make. You can be virtuous, or you can be inhumane. Those are the choices. Frederick Douglass, who I'll move to now, another major figure, read Uncle Tom's Cabin. I should say Uncle Tom's Cabin was not an abolitionist novel. An abolitionist novel was a novel that advocated an immediate end to slavery and advocated full social equality. And most opponents of slavery, most white opponents of slavery, were anti-slavery, meaning they believed slavery was evil and wrong, but it should be gradually eliminated so as not to uproot society. Essentially, anti-slavery advocates were not revolutionaries, were not radical. Abolitionists advocated for an immediate end to slavery and racial equality. Stowe was anti-slavery. She never defined herself as an abolitionist, even though she effectively became one. In fact, after the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin, William Lloyd Garrison invited her to give the keynote speech to the American Anti-Slavery Society, and Stowe declined by saying that to do so would be like ripping the Bible, her Bible, from her. So she clearly read the Bible as a kind of gradualist reform measure. African Americans created the abolition movement, meaning the advocacy for an immediate end to slavery and full racial equality, beginning in the colonial period, and the leading, in fact, Frederick Douglass was the leading abolitionist, black or white. He spoke to more people than anyone else in the 19th century, according to David Blight's brilliant, relatively new biography, than anyone except for possibly Mark Twain. He was, without question, one of, if not the greatest orators in the 19th century during the golden age of oratory, in which public speaking was, the best way to characterize it was, it's analogous to a popular sporting event. A public speaker would draw tens of thousands of people, and a popular public speaker. And it was one of the few forms of entertainment. In fact, by the time when Douglass died in 1895, there was a eulogy to him in the Chicago Tribune, which was a white newspaper, and it summarized his stature by saying, "No man, black or white, has been better known for nearly half a century in this country than Douglass. He was so highly esteemed by the white people as well as blacks that his entrance into their midst upon any public occasion was always the signal for an enthusiastic personal greeting." He was not only considered the preeminent orator during the golden age of oratory. But he also became, in the 19th century, the most photographed American. There are more separate photographs of Douglass than of any other single figure, more than of Lincoln, more than anyone else, which captures his popularity. This is, what I'm showing you is the very first known daguerreotype of Douglass from 1841. This is Douglass in 1863, and Douglass Douglass saw his relationship to photography as what I call a pas de trois, a kind of dance for three between the camera, the photographer, and the sitter. And he always presented himself as an activist. He always stared directly into the camera lens, even though photographers encouraged men in particular to look above or away from the lens, because he wanted to confront the leader. He wanted to send a message that he was a representative American that had the rights of all other Americans. He always dressed up. He confronted the viewer. He demanded essentially equality, and that was his signature pose. In fact, from the very first pose through the Civil War, he defied the convention and looked directly into the camera lens. Then after the war, as he becomes an elder statesman and he is the first African American to receive a federal appointment that requires Senate approval, he then starts looking away from the camera lens in a kind of statesman-like, a traditional statesman-like pose. This is a photograph of Douglass from 1852, in which in fact, Harry Beecher Stowe saw this daguerreotype of Douglass and said that he looked majestic in his wrath, which I think is a great line. It was a kind of wrathful majesty. Douglass, as I said, was extremely well known. He always dressed up. Douglass was also the very first person to write extensively on photography as a form of protest and as a form of aesthetics. In fact, he's one of the early theorists of aesthetics. And in fact, in one of his speeches on photography and representation, he said, and this is a really powerful line, he said, "Poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, and this ability is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be in the reflection of what is, and endeavor to remove the contradiction." So in other words, he's continually seeking a democratic, egalitarian space, and that a great artist is also always, according to Douglass, an activist. That's what great art should be about, regardless of genre, of moving the needle, both at the level of a small community, but more significantly at the level of the nation. Artists are always activists for Douglass. And the power, the beauty of that art, whether it's a photograph of oneself or whether it's a novel or whether it's another form of art, can transform the individual and transform a community and transform a nation. And it's one of the reasons why Douglass tirelessly gave so many speeches, because he wanted to change the hearts and minds of Americans. There is a very close, or I should say there are some very rich parallels, between Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Both are, in my view, the two preeminent self-made men in the 19th century. Men who rose up from nothing, basically, and became major inspirations and leaders. Douglass had zero formal education. Lincoln had less than a year of formal education. And without any formal education, both become, in my view, among the most powerful and effective nonfiction orators and writers. And I should say, in my view, Douglass is a much better writer than Lincoln, but part of Lincoln's stature as one of the great presidents, especially in the 19th century, stems from his oratory. A great president needed to be a great speaker and writer to send a message that was very clear and nuanced. If you could not speak and articulate yourself effectively, especially in the 19th century, you had a problem as a leader, especially as a political leader. So Douglass and Lincoln both essentially grew up without any formal education. They're two of the preeminent self-made men in terms of rising up from virtually nothing and becoming absolutely indispensable national figures and leaders. There are a number of other parallels besides their lack of formal education and their writing. They both grew up in pretty rough, Douglass's as growing up enslaved, vicious communities. Both defined a turning point in their lives as a fight. Douglass, how many of you have not read one of Douglass's autobiographies? You should read. You should read. So the turning point in all three, the last one is Life and Times, is Douglass's famous fight with Covey. Edward Covey, who's this sadistic slave breaker. Douglass is on the eastern shore of Maryland, and his one of his co-owners, Thomas Auld, feels like he can't handle Douglass, so he rents him out. And this was very popular in the southern states, in the slave states. And it was a way to make money, is you rented out your property, a slave, for a year to someone to do work, and you received an income from that. So it was very much defining enslaved people as commodities. And his master rented him out to this truly sadistic slave breaker, Edward Covey, to help to cultivate wheat on the eastern shore of Maryland. Covey was, Douglass referred to him as a snake and a sadist. And Covey was one of the common white Southerner who was born into a poor white family. By the time Douglass was rented out to him, Covey owned one slave. And during the year that Douglass was rented out to Covey, the one slave that Covey owned was a female slave. And he forced another male slave to sleep with the female slave he owned in a tiny little shack. And at the end of the year, she was pregnant. And by the time Douglass left Covey in the year, Covey now owned two slaves. And it's what Douglass referred to as a kind of a forced effort at slave breeding. But in any event, Covey beat Douglass at least once a week and brutalized him, and he finally stood up to Covey. And Douglass, a parallel with Douglass and Lincoln is that Lincoln was 6'4" in his bare feet, and Douglass was 6'2". He was rented out to Covey, a very tall, muscular teenager. And Covey was an average height of men about 5'2" or 3". And Douglass decided to stand up to Covey, and he had the fight. It was more like a wrestling match, and Douglass was careful not to pummel Covey. He could have, but he said that his fight with Covey was the turning point in my career. After this fight, He defined himself as a free man in form, even if he was a slave man and a slave in fact, and it led him to do everything he could to escape. And for the rest of his life, that was his turning point. And Lincoln, in his campaign biography of 1860, referred to his fight with Jack Wilson in Illinois, who was part of a gang of rough and tumblers, in which it was not uncommon to gouge an eye out in a fight. The fights were known as rough and tumbles in the frontier space, and Jack challenged Lincoln to a fight, and Lincoln was very tall. Again, defended himself against Jack, and Jack essentially, or Lincoln said that Jack gave up, he got tired, and Lincoln referred to that as also a central turning point in his life. So they were both major writers and orators. They both grew up in rough, vicious communities. And they defined themselves as, in terms of a fight leading to their self-making. Lincoln also, not nearly as much as Douglas, was hugely influenced by the photograph and the effect that a photograph could have on one's public persona. And for most presidential scholars, or most scholars of Lincoln, they argue that a contributing factor, a central contributing factor to Lincoln's election in 1860 was the Matthew Brady photograph of Lincoln that then became, as an engraving cut from it, the front page of Harper's Weekly and other magazines. And that Brady photograph was widely circulated in multiple other forms. Here's a presidential campaign button of Lincoln. But this was the first photograph. Lincoln acknowledges it himself. Unlike Douglas, all previous photographs, Lincoln was notorious for having a kind of bad hair day. His hair was like all over the place. He didn't look presidential. He didn't look sophisticated. This is the first time he actually buys a suit before the photograph, and he actually looks presidential. He looks statesmanlike for the first time. That's then widely circulated. Douglas also is the first African American to meet with and advise the U.S. president when he meets with Lincoln 3 times in the White House. Douglas is a radical abolitionist from the beginning. Douglas is deeply unhappy with Lincoln when war breaks out. Now, for those of you who don't remember, when Lincoln is elected president, when he takes the oath of office, 7 states have already seceded, the Confederacy's already been formed, and his main goal is to reunite, is to encourage the seceded states back into the Union. Douglas is outraged at that, and Douglas, in fact, he was so frustrated with Lincoln's first inaugural address that he plans a trip to Haiti. And he says, if Haiti is like this black republic that I've read about, I'm leaving the United States, because with this man as president, there's no way that we're going to achieve freedom, because Lincoln is trying to capitulate with the states who've already seceded. The upshot is that Southerners bomb Fort Sumter, starts the war, and from the beginning, Douglas sends a message, and Douglas is the most public in terms of his voice from Fort Sumter to the end of his war. His greatest significance is during the war years, where he gives more speeches than he ever has. He writes more articles on how to end the war. And Douglas is one of the first individuals, black or white, to emphasize that the easiest way to win the war is to end slavery and arm blacks. The blacks are the stomach of the rebellion. They will help us end the rebellion, and to create a true democracy and destroy the rebellion is the easiest way to win the war. And that eventually became what happened. But for Lincoln and the vast majority of Republicans right after the war, the primary aim was to preserve the Union. And Douglas made it clear that preserving the Union necessitated abolishing slavery. There's no way you can preserve a Union without abolishing this slavery. There's no way that can happen. And that eventually is something that Lincoln accepted and acknowledged. And Douglas, as I said, was deeply critical of Lincoln. Beginning in 1863, following finally the Emancipation Proclamation that frees all slaves in northern states and arms and opens the way for arming northern regiments. Douglas meets with Lincoln for the first time, and the first of three meetings, and I'll just briefly summarize them, because it's the first time that an African American meets with the United States president in terms of equals. And the first meeting is in August of 1863. Following Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson Davis passes a proclamation that authorizes the murder of any African American soldier. And Douglas's two sons, Charles and Lewis, are the first two enrollers of the Massachusetts 54th. I've seen the muster roll. Lewis and Charles are the first two names on the muster roll. And so his sons are now in the war, and Jefferson Davis has issued this proclamation authorizing rebel officers to murder African Americans, and Lincoln isn't doing anything to counteract that, so Douglas decides he's going to go to Washington, D.C. and try to have a meeting directly with Lincoln. He arrives early in the morning on August 10th, and there's already a long line of men waiting to see Lincoln. Lincoln had a relatively open-door policy. Douglas sends up his card, and Lincoln calls Douglas up immediately. So he passes all these white men in line. And when he enters in Lincoln's office, Lincoln begins the conversation and says, "Hello, Mr. Douglas, it's good to meet you." Finally, he says, "I know you've been very critical of me and of my policies. Let me try to defend myself." They have a 2-hour meeting in that first meeting. And the upshot is that Lincoln, shortly thereafter, within the next day or so, issues a retaliatory order saying for any African American murdered, we will execute a rebel prisoner of war, which stems the murder on both sides. And both men publicly defined themselves as friends after this first meeting. And friendship at the time, friendship today has become a commodity. There's a breakfast cereal named Friends. There are a number of other commodities named Friends to sell something. But at that time, and it goes back to classical antiquity and Western culture, friendship was a powerful concept that was both spiritual and personal, that conveyed this sense of two bodies uniting into almost one soul. But also more particular in terms of the relationship between Douglas and Lincoln, friendship was always implied a notion of equality, that two friends were equals. That was a prerequisite almost for friendship, that what the two friends needed to be equals. So for Lincoln to publicly refer to Douglas as a friend is this. At that time, people recognized that it was a sense of equality. Lincoln then, in the second meeting, this was in 1864, in August of 1864, in which the war was going horribly. Lincoln felt he was going to lose re-election because of all the deaths. It was before Sherman took Atlanta. And George McClellan was running as the Democratic president on a platform of ending the war immediately and the only question would be leaving slavery intact. Well, slavery would be left intact in the southern states, and the only question was, would the South be allowed to remain a separate slave-owning nation, or should it return to the United States with slavery intact? But in either event, had Lincoln lost the 1864 election, there's a very good chance that slavery would have continued in the southern states as it had been. And so Lincoln asks Douglas to come to the White House. And when Douglas arrives in D.C., Lincoln has a presidential carriage that brings him to the White House, and he essentially asks Douglas, in my view, it's really to create the first example of a special forces, a kind of Green Beret or Navy SEALs, in which he says, take some hand-picked men, African Americans who know the South, where you establish positions in the South, where you recruit as many Africans as possible, because with these African Americans, if we arm them and put them into the Army, and the Navy had been integrated at the beginning of the war, that can lead to a major military victory that will allow me to get reelected, change the tide of public opinion in the North. And Douglas was amazed at what Lincoln asked him to do, and he writes a 20-page detailed prospectus, so to speak, articulating the men that he wants to be placed into the South to recruit African Americans to serve in the various forces to achieve a military victory. As it turns out, it never gets implemented because Sherman takes Atlanta, and with March to the Sea, that dramatically changes the tide of Northern opinion, and Lincoln is reelected. That second meeting highlights the degree to which Lincoln recognizes that he needed Douglas, he needed African Americans in general, in order to win the war. The third meeting was at Lincoln's second inaugural, and I'm showing you a photograph, which I've done some close reading of. I've circled Douglas in the center. Down below, Lincoln is at the platform reading it, and you also see I've also circled up above. John Wilkes Booth is already scoping out Lincoln in the quest to assassinate him, who is Booth, and his conspirators are deeply Southern. Douglas went to the White House reception following Lincoln's second inaugural, and Lincoln sees Douglas enter and raises. He's surrounded by a group of white men and women, and he raises his arm and he yells out, "Hello, Mr. Douglas. I saw you in the crowd today. What did you think of my address? There is no man in these United States whose opinion I value more than yours." And we know that that's accurate because there's a woman who was right next to Lincoln at the time who wrote that in her diary. That's how we get the quote. And Douglas responds, "Mr. President, that was a sacred effort in terms of his inaugural address." And I should say that Douglas was very critical of a lot of Lincoln's speeches. Douglas did not pull any punches when he thought a speech was bad, and he thought a lot of Lincoln's speeches were truly miserable. And this one, he said, was one of the great speeches. Of course, Lincoln is assassinated. Mary Todd then gives, after Lincoln's death, gives Douglas one of Lincoln's canes as a token of their relationship. So those are two men in which they define self-making in not rising up to get rich, but in helping to reform in terms of, in a sense, activism. One, the radical, two, the more centrist or progressive. And you see the evolution from, in a sense, enemies to friends, divergence to convergence, in one sense, the relationship, the ultimate friendship between Douglas and Lincoln is a model or a historical note that reflects the degree to which interracial coalitions in the United States have happened mostly when there is a profoundly threatening enemy in which blacks and whites recognize. And the same thing would happen with the rise of, in the 20th century, with the rise of communism following World War II. But beginning with World War II, there was an understanding. Actually, the Navy started integrating ships in World War II at the beginning of the war, and African American served as soldiers later on in the war. And in the Civil War, because it makes no sense in a naval ship to have segregated ships, a ship of blacks or a ship of whites, African Americans also in the Civil War knew the waterways and were leaders in naval boats in the Civil War. So the Navy was fully integrated from the beginning of the Civil War to the end. In World War II, the armed forces weren't fully integrated until the end, and then Truman passes passes a bill or issues a proclamation integrating the armed services entirely. But I mention that really as a way to point out that because of the power of race and racism in the United States, the only times there has been considerable I'll call it improvement in race relations is when the United States is facing a powerful, threatening enemy, and white leaders recognize that the only way they can defeat this powerful, threatening enemy is the crucial support of African Americans, where there's then collaboration. That's a thesis of a number of scholars. Not all of you may agree with it. But it does highlight the profound divide, the scourge of racism that continues in the country. So I've spoken enough for at least a while, but do you have, I could continue, but do you have any questions, comments, criticisms?
Let me ask a question, John.
Okay.
First. So, these biographical reflections emphasize the theme of self-making.
Yes.
And an extension of the theme of self-making is the reinvention of the self.
That's right.
And the idea of the reinvention of the self becomes especially prominent in the course of the 20th century.
Yes. But as I said, we wanted to suggest it's also prominent in the 19th century as well.
But it's deepened, right?
Yeah.
And,
yes, and it is deep in all.
Because then the question is, what are the manifestations of this self-making? It's not just an ascent by the standard of worldly success.
Right.
It's an ability to continue remaking the self,
Yes.
even when the remaking of the self entails a cost.
Yes.
By the measure of worldly
Yes.
success.
So that's a great question. In the 19th century, through the early 20th century, self-making was this understanding of a continual evolution of the self. And
so the concept of the self-made man is typically associated with an idea of conventional worldly success.
yes,
When the self-making goes beyond the frontiers of this conventional view of worldly success, it becomes something different, doesn't it?
yes,
Or at least you could say it's a deepening.
It is a deepening, but there's two different definitions of self-making. One, the 19th century to the early 20th century, and the self-making is this continual evolution, and it's not necessarily based on wealth. It's one continues to evolve depending on what their particular interests are, whether you're an activist or a reformer, or whether you're a politician, or whether you're you try to continually improve and better yourself. And there's this notion that the self is continually evolving, continually fluid. And beginning with robber barons or the captains of industry in the late 19th century, that's when self-making becomes connected specifically to wealth. That that becoming rich is part of the.
So that was a preliminary question.
Okay. Okay.
The complications of the idea of self
Right.
as being more or less worldly.
Yes.
But it leads into what was my ulterior question, which is the apparent contradiction between self-making and susceptibility to conformity, which is
Yes,
of course
yes,
the central
yes,
theme
yes,
in
yes,
the
yes,
characteristic American
Yes,
people of
yes,
Emerson.
yes,
So Emerson,
yes, and Thoreau, and yes,
so
and
it's
Whitman.
already, and already appears in Tocqueville.
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
So the Americans are described as fixed on this ideal of self-making.
Yes,
In both worldly and less worldly.
yes,
forms,
yes,
but is also extraordinarily susceptible to conformity and even in its most overt expression, which is peer pressure.
yes,
That is,
yes,
they are mimetic.
yes, yes.
They are apprehensive of the
Yes.
pressure of the milieu in
Yes.
which they operate.
Yes.
Now, did they not forever experience this as a contradiction? And where does this susceptibility to conformity come from? So,
Yes.
so I take it that what Tocqueville and Emerson and others are saying is not just that this is a universal human characteristic,
Right.
but that in the United States it seems to be aggravated.
Yes. Yes.
Why is it aggravated? What is the structural or ideological basis of this arousal and inflammation?
Because that's. So I think that it's because of the ideal of democracy that it makes people uncomfortable or scared or nervous to feel as though they stand outside of norms. And that the idea of the 19th century notion of self-making is that one is continually evolving, but as one evolves, if one evolves in a way that is moves apart from a normative standard, that can lead to insecurities. It can lead to this desire then to be part of a group, to be
No, I
part.
understand, but why? What's the basis of this in American experience? Is it something structural about the United States, or is it some ideological?
That's a great question.
tendency?
So part of it is structural. You see it especially in frontier spaces in the Western. The isolado, the isolado figure, the figure who stands solely alone and apart.
And who is a disruptor.
And who is a disruptor is often also a bit unstable.
Yes, and is that not part of self-making?
Not necessarily. So the idea, well, for a lot of people, the ideal of self-making is to be able to influence the society, to be able.
So I think early in the course, we discussed the Deweyan progressive.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So John Dewey was the major ideologist of education in the United States.
Right.
And his program was adopted in the elite at the elite level of American education.
Right.
The private schools, the
Right.
top tier of public schools.
Right.
Not at the lower level.
Right.
But it was adopted in a truncated form.
Right.
And the part of the program that was not adapted and instead replaced by something else was the part that implied now troublemaking
Right.
and criticism.
Right.
So the troublemaker, the disruptor, the enemy of the cohesion of the group
Right.
should be isolated, as you
Right.
just said.
Right.
We should contain him and suppress him.
Right.
Now, is that not on its face a flat contradiction to the ideal of self-making? I'm just trying to understand this American ideology.
It depends it depends on how far you take the isolato figure. So on the one hand, I mean, and it's part of the answer to this, the desire to be part of a group and the desire to be independent and have and develop ideas or arguments or things of oneself, that to be a complete isolato leads to
That's sort of artificial, right? That the troublemaker does not intend to be isolated in that sense. He intends to be prophetic. That is, he intends to enact some form of defiance,
right,
which is not just an individual adventure,
right,
but a model for the transformation of the group.
right.
But that kind of troublemaking is viewed at a minimum with intense ambivalence. in
Correct.
the dominant American form of social liberty.
Right.
And that troublemaker, even though he intends to be a prophet,
Right.
rather than an islado, is
Right.
still contained, suppressed, and attacked.
Yes.
Under the reign of the ideals of conformity.
That's right. But in a sense, it's similar to, Emerson and Thoreau and Douglass. Lincoln eventually, Lincoln midway through the war recognized the revolutionary nature of what he was doing as president and was deeply troubled by it. Whereas Douglass and Thoreau and Emerson and other figures were radicals and revolutionaries and embraced that vision and recognized the way in which they stood apart from the masses but felt comfortable with it.
So I think the problem with your selection of biographies, is that, except for Franklin, all the others
Right.
that you focus on, bring up the issue of slavery
Yes.
and the relation between black and white in the United States.
Yes.
And that's such an egregious form of oppression
Yes.
that we can say that we can all agree on that. And to
But in
attack that,
but in the 19th century, it wasn't seen that way.
well, it wasn't seen as part of this country, especially in the South.
Right.
View. But one side won, and so now in retrospect, we see that as the good guys against the bad guys and so forth. But once you go beyond that to the cases in which the object of criticism or attack is more controversial,
Right.
and the prophet is acting in a muddled territory,
Right.
where the distinction between virtue and vice is not so clear,
Right.
right and wrong,
Right.
and is trying to innovate at the cost of disrupting the group.
Right.
That's where the problem is.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it seems that there, the predominant sensibility in the country, overwhelmingly, is against the disruptor. So the opposite view would be the disruptors are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. You could say that's what's implied in Emerson's view. And that's the view that on the whole the Americans rejected. Is it not?
Yeah, but it depends on the specific circumstance. So Emerson and Thoreau. I mean, it depends on where you're living. In Boston, there were a lot of Boston in the 1850s following the fugitive slave law to try to.
Returning to the issue of slavery, and I wanted to get beyond that.
But
the cases that are not so literally black and white.
Okay, but it would be true with. I mean, Thoreau and Emerson didn't. I mean, they both knew Douglass, but by the 1850s, they really did not interact with African Americans very much at all. But they became abolitionists, and they're both in Concord. They're in a very white community, and they received a lot of criticism from a lot of their peers at that time. And then their writings from the time they died through the 20th century were particularly their writings that emphasized the isolado figure were seen as less than admirable, I'll say.
Well, let's take another figure
Okay.
of the 19th century, Melville.
Yes.
So, how would you characterize Melville's attitude to the disruptor?
He was he was a brilliant, radical he was as revolutionary a disruptor in his own way
Yes.
as someone like Douglass was, or someone like David Walker was, and it's why.
But instead of so let's replace now this focus on slavery just for the moment,
Okay.
for the sake of the argument, with Nietzsche's emphasis
Yes.
on conventional morality.
Yes, 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 yes,
And
yes,
the disruptor is then the disruptor of the conventional.
yes,
Huh?
yes,
And so that would be a deepening of the idea of
Yes.
self-making.
yes,
Right?
yes. And Nietzsche celebrated that.
And celebrated that, and that's a higher form.
But a lot of people since have seen Nietzsche as a lunatic.
Yes, yes.
So in that's my point. It's
So
that
that's what often happens to the prophet.
yes, that the prophet
So the
is
question is,
yes.
who is the false prophet and who is the true prophet?
That's a great question.
So
So
it's easy if all the cases that you focus on are cases in which, in retrospect, we all agree on who were the true prophets and the false prophets.
not really. If you in the southern states.
But I'm not talking about then, I'm talking about now.
I'm saying it now. So there are. I mean, even now there are a lot of white Southerners who think that Emerson and Thoreau, and especially Emerson and Thoreau's writings, are horrible and not worth spending time with.
Well, take another figure who we have discussed, not in the course, but outside the course, Huey Long.
Yeah, Huey Long is a good.
There's a consensus in the American elite that Huey Long was bad, but Huey Long was in another respect good, right?
Yes,
Huey Long
yes, yes.
attacked the ideological consensus in the United States.
Yes,
He
yes.
promoted a popular program. in
Yes,
Louisiana.
every man a king, every woman a queen, and he actually included African. He was one of the very few white Southerners to include African Americans in his vision of every man a king, every woman a queen.
Yes.
But he was, and he had to be
And
corrupt.
giving consequence to the notion of 40 acres and a mule
Yes,
going beyond
yes,
giving substance.
Yes, yes,
Practical substance.
yes,
to it.
yes.
So, did the country not always need more disruptors like that?
It depends on what kind of disruption. I mean, Huey Long is a great example. I mean, there's Southerners who still love Huey Long, but there's Southerners who hate him. Similar, there's still Northerners or Americans who hate Emerson and Thoreau and those who love him. So I think that the disruptor can lend itself either to a profoundly, but in both cases, radical, virtuous figure, or an enemy, someone who threatens the nation, threatens the very meaning of the nation.
This is an ambiguity or an ambivalence that's already in Christianity.
Yes,
right?
that's exactly
Because
right.
Christ says,
Yes.
I come with a sword.
Yes.
Christ preaches universal
That's exactly
love.
right. That's
But he
exactly.
also said, I come to throw
That's-
brother against
that's
brother,
exactly
and
right.
son against father.
That's exactly right.
And that's part of Christianity.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's
And-
exactly right.
And then these figures like Billy Graham and Norman Vincent Peale,
Yes.
who are the supposed exponents of Christianity in
Yes.
the United States,
Yes.
how do they then deal with this ambiguity that is not just in the American beliefs, but in its Christian background?
Billy Graham very much embraced the Jesus with the sword. Very much embraced that in fighting the Cold War. And he was Billy Graham. He very much embraced Jesus with the sword, fighting the Cold War. And whereas others, so Billy Graham, in many respects, is the antithesis of the Quakers. That's the one deeply.
You're giving the militaristic interpretation, but I was thinking of the self-making as involving deeper and deeper levels of defiance and disruption
Yes.
against the conventional views.
Yes. Yes.
Not in favor of the conventional views, as your example suggested.
Although Billy Graham was, he was.
But this is a detour because you haven't answered my question. My question was, what is the basis in the American experience, in American history, in the American institutions, in American culture, of this extraordinary susceptibility to conformity? Where does it come from?
I think it comes from the insecurity of standing alone, of being an isolado. And you see that in the writings of a lot of them, is that there is something that, sociologists and psychologists will, emphasize that to be part of a group, to be part of a community, is much easier. It requires less mental and intellectual and emotional fortitude and strength, it's much easier to feel that you're part of a group, feel that you're part of a community, than to see. It takes far more courage to embrace one's status as an isolado.
So the ideal of self-making then can be given two interpretations, just to simplify.
Yes.
I want to make myself into an agent.
Yes.
Who can be a successful and admired member of a community.
That's exactly right.
So that's the worldly interpretation of
Yes.
self-making.
Yes.
The otherworldly or transcendent interpretation is, I want to discover a new realm of experience,
Yes.
which can be then the seed of another form of community,
Yes.
of collaboration, which doesn't yet exist.
Yes.
But in the meantime, I will be the enemy of an established form of community. I will disrupt it.
Yes.
I will come with a
Yes.
sword against
Yes.
the conventional
Yes.
morality.
Yes.
Now, it seems that of these two interpretations of the ideal of self-making, it's the second which is truer to the original impulse, right?
In the
It's
19th,
highly
in the 19th century it is, but in the 20th century, the notion of self-made man and self-made woman I mentioned to you emerges in the late 19th century. But in the 20th century, self-making is almost exclusively associated with wealth, with money, and that's to be part of this. To shine in the world, to be part of an entitled group. And in the 19th century, self-making, it was much more open-ended in that it was not based on wealth. So we talked earlier about someone like the Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. Even though they came from money, they were seen in the Gilded Age as the great self-made men of their era, even though they started with quite a bit of money. But because of what they did with it, they were seen as, in fact, there are newspaper articles that are devoted to saying J.P. Morgan is the greatest self-made man in our nation's history.
Even though he was the son of a rich man.
Yes, even though he's the son of a rich man. Yeah. So it's that pretty dramatic divide in how that self is located, and the degree to which that self identifies with, particularly beginning in the late 19th century, with a community of wealth and with wealth. And it's really at that point, at that time when, and it wasn't the case through the Civil War, that, I mean, everyone knows that today, I mean, it's a cliche. Money is the scorecard of success. That's a cliche today. And it's been a cliche for a long period of time. That if you don't have money, then you cannot be successful. You cannot be in fact, there's a lot of people identify wealth with intelligence. In fact, arguably a majority of Americans identify wealth with intelligence.
Well, pagan ideas, right?
Yes, yeah.
Christ said, "Be in the world, but not of it."
Yes.
He said it's easier for a camel to pass the
Yes,
eye of a needle
yes.
than for a rich man to enter
Yes,
the kingdom,
yes.
and so forth.
Yes.
And this is the background then of this world.
That's right. But it's I mean, in the late 19th, early 20th century, in fact, the Wanamaker family, they reinterpreted the Bible. In fact, throughout the early 20th century, some of the most popular preachers radically reinterpreted Scripture by saying, Jesus wants us to be rich. Seriously.
And why does he want us to be rich?
Because it's a sign of our
Divine favor.
Yes, divine favor and faith. I mean, to his credit, Billy Graham didn't push that button that much, but at times he did. That's a central theme, and in fact, in religious studies, that's a major point of discussion of the degree to which, especially beginning in the Gilded Age, in the post Civil War period, this connection between wealth and divine virtue becomes intimate.
So I think we do want the class to go into the
Yes.
conversation, but I want to say one more thing. So this is related to a theme of very general interest in the world, which we touched on briefly in the course.
Right,
In most countries in the world today, most people are poor,
right,
and they are either, if not absolutely poor, at least relatively poor.
right,
And their horizon of aspiration, as I remarked in the earlier class, is petty bourgeois rather than proletarian.
right,
So they aspire to modest prosperity and
Right.
independence.
right,
And the default object of aspiration economically is isolated, retrograde family business.
right,
Um,
Right.
And on the spiritual side, the default option is some form of materialism, consumerism, and individualism.
right,
And those go together.
Right.
The diminished economic form
Right.
with the diminished spiritual
Right.
form.
Right.
So then the task of the disruptors, or one of their tasks, would be to have a prophetic message about an alternative way
Right.
of satisfying that aspiration,
Right.
which is, after all, in its essence, a noble aspiration
Right.
to ascend to a higher form of life.
That's right.
But there should be an alternative to this retrograde economic form,
That's right.
a broader menu of options that would require the reorganization of the market and of democracy.
Right.
And on the spiritual side, there should be a set of forms of experience that are more magnanimous, ambitious, and solidaristic
Right.
than this consumerist,
Right.
individualist form.
Right.
And this then requires from the individuals that the individuals take risks,
Right.
that they be disruptive,
Right.
and that they give this disruptive direction to the ideal of self-making.
Right.
That's the argument.
Right.
And is that or is that not then part of the American conversation?
Yeah, it is part of the American conversation, and it's one of the reasons why. I mean, we've talked about it. Why the shift from a producerist ethos to a consumer identity is a major shift that has occurred in the United States that lends itself.
So the reason why I asked the question in this last form is the issue of how the Americans can join this worldwide conversation about this problem, that is, the destiny, the fate of this subjective petty bourgeoisie. They're not
Right.
objectively petty bourgeois because
Right.
they're poor,
Right.
but they're subjectively petty bourgeois because of this horizon of aspiration.
Right.
And
Right.
the question is how to make it more inclusive, better, higher, rather than this degenerate form which it characteristically takes in the world. And that's both an ideological question and a spiritual question. And
Yes.
so my interest now as a foreigner is how the Americans can be induced to join this worldwide conversation
Right.
in a form that they can recognize as emerging from their own history
Right.
and from their own experience.
Well, one is to, in my view, sketch out solutions in your book, in your new book. Is that, and so one would be to re-embrace the notion of a producerist ethos instead of a consumerist ethos. I mean, Americans increasingly, part of the petty bourgeois mentality is that they are able to consume things that they feel define themselves as petty bourgeois rather than poor. And yet what they're,
So they're not part of the small business class.
Right.
But it's as if they think
That's right.
as if they were part of
because of what they can acquire, what they can pursue, whether it's with debt or not. That's part of the problem. And whereas you don't see that, for example, in there are very few left, but essentially like family farmers. You know, people who are still trying to, whether it's in Vermont or whether it's in places of Iowa, that there's a real pride in running a family farm that's very much distinct from this petty bourgeois understanding based on consumerism. Because the family farms, they're still define themselves as makers or producers.
Well, we should ask the class.
Yes, yes. Questions, comments, criticisms? Yes.
I just had a question. In terms of Uncle Tom's Cabin, how do you think Uncle Tom began to carry negative connotations in today's world, given that Uncle Tom is portrayed as the protagonist in the novel, and Josiah Henson
Yes.
actually worked to free enslaved people.
Yes. So it's based on Josiah Henson. The novel is it's recovered. I mean, the main reason why Uncle Tom's Cabin came to be seen by the early 20th century as a very bad novel, and that was the common designation, is the same reason, is because of the way in which white Southerners gained control of the story of the Civil War. And from the 1890s, the first histories of the Civil War, Henry Wilson's 3-volume history of the Civil War, Douglas and a number of African Americans wrote early histories of the Civil War. They're the most accurate representations of the Civil War until in the last 5 to 10 years, actually. But one of the main objectives, and they were open about this, is white Southerners wanted to gain the control of the story of the Civil War, so that by early 20th century, slavery had nothing to do with the war. It was based on the aggressive industrial nature of the North, and they portrayed most white Southerners as artisans, as independent farmers, and on plantations they saw they defined the plantation as a big happy family in which there's a natural hierarchy. It's a kind of a feudalist society in that there are enslaved people, but they're happy and they're a natural part of the hierarchy. And that the war ultimately was not about slavery. From roughly 1900 to 1980s, the main argument of the Civil War was that slavery was incidental. It was about northern industry and aggression. Southerners accused or argued that the North, there are already these huge corporations, and exploitation of capital exploitation of labor was far worse than what enslaved people had to do in the South. They really completely controlled the story of the Civil War. And you see it manifested in the AP US history. I don't think it was around, but the major textbooks through the 1980s and into the 1990s, you could read U.S. histories and you'd never encounter or rarely encounter an African American, much less a black abolitionist. They were read by African Americans and radicals, but it was not mainstream. And so that radical rewriting of the story of the whole era is reflected also in the condemnation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in fact, there's a number of great examples of, some of the major writers of the 20th century who were Southerners said that their teachers prohibited them from reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, from reading the actual novel. They wouldn't allow it. And in fact, even at the time, because of the power of the novel, Southerners hired white Southerners writers to rewrite Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there's a number of novels that came out within the next 5 years after Uncle Tom's Cabin, called Uncle Robin in His Cabin, and you have these photos of, slavery as this benevolent institution, we're all part of this big happy family, trying to check the degree to which Stowe exposes the inhumanity of slavery. So it's a long answer, but it's profound. I mean, and it's crucial to understand the degree to which white Southerners gain control of the story of the Civil War. And in fact, white Southerners also gain control of English departments and history departments, and in their private correspondence, it's made clear that they will not tolerate any criticism or condemnation against their meaning Southern way, white Southern way of life. And part of the emergence of history departments in the United States, history as a discipline, English as a discipline in the United States, and its evolution stem from white Southerners being in control of that discipline and forcing Northerners to accept the Southern interpretation of what constitutes great literature and what constitutes correct history. And the influence that has had over almost 100 years is truly profound. And it's only been, as I said, in the last 10 to 15 years that things have started to be corrected. What I find particularly insidious, and I should say that I'm betraying my own sensibility, is that a lot of historians, professionally trained historians, believe in the notion of historical objectivity, meaning they believe that each generation of historical scholarship gets progressively closer and closer to the truth of what happened. And if you actually read the first histories of the Civil War era, and then you see this profound decline, because for most of the 20th century, slavery was seen as a benevolent institution by history books.
I know, those are good terms. I hope I answered them.
And so the idea of historical objectivity needs to be thrown out the window.
Out of the same, yeah.
Exploded, but that's not a